All right, we're talking about Joel this morning. I won't ask for a show of hands, but we know lots and lots about Joel, right? Everybody's fully versed. You got the full biography of Joel. All right, no, obviously. What do we know about Joel? Anybody want to throw out a fact about Joel? The man, not the book.
His name means Yahweh is God.
Jehovah is God, right? All right, that's one of the things we know. What else do we know about Joel? Son of Pethuel. We've hit the two easy ones so far. What else? There's one more thing we definitively know about Joel.
Prophet of God.
To prophet to who?
Man, then erase it.
50% chance.
I'm going to say Israel.
Judah.
Well,
All right.
it's
okay.
I don't bet.
It's all right. 50-50. All right. And Judah includes what tribes? Judah and Benjamin, too. All right. That's what we know about Joel for sure. There's one more thing we think we know a little bit, at least about this book, which is the time frame. Now, if you were here Wednesday night, and Ben, I left this timeline up, and I appreciate somebody not erasing the whole thing so that I could use it again. Joel's timeline for when the book was written is a little squishy, right? We're not 100% sure when it was written, but when do we think? Anybody remember that from Wednesday? When do we think Joel was written? 8 something. That's about as good as anybody could guess anyway, right? It's probably in here somewhere, right? Somewhere in the 800 to 900 BC period, 900 to 800 BC. It could be all the way down here or wherever. The events in Joel don't really give us a clear picture of where, but we're pretty sure Joel is here. By we, I mean scholars who've actually spent way more time studying this than I have. So it's early on, right? The kingdom divides in 931. Shortly after, or sometime shortly after, Joel is sent to prophesy to the people. All right, so recapping a couple other things while I try to recap this pen. Why is this a minor prophet? We remember that from Wednesday. Minor means it's short book, right? Not less important, not less impactful. It's just a short book. And what we're going to study in this whole class, it's a variety of short books. Why does it matter? Why do these prophecies matter? Why do we read about in the major and minor prophets? What are we leading to? Jesus, ultimately, right? Okay, there's a pretty big messianic prophecy in Joel. We're not going to get to it today, but we'll be there Wednesday. So come back Wednesday night for that one. But you're going to see that in all these books that we're studying. And then one more, what does prophecy mean, right? So there's a Hebrew word, nabi, for prophecy. It's a verb. What does it mean? Do you remember what we said that meant? To bubble forth, right? That's what these prophets are doing. They're not speaking for themselves, right? They're being inspired. It's the word of God within them. They're bubbling forth. So as we read these, as we go through these books, we need to always remember that, right? This is, Joel is bubbling forth prophecy from God. All right, so let's get into Joel itself. And I'm just going to kind of assume that everybody did the reading. But if you didn't, you don't have to fess up now. Just catch up after. We're mostly going to be looking at the front half of Joel. But there's 3 words I want you to remember that are kind of going to summarize Joel for you. If you come out of this class with nothing else, the next time somebody asks you about Joel, you can at least throw these 3 words out. And forgive my writing ahead of time. I'll at least try to make it legible today. Judgment, promise, or hope, I'm going to put here in parentheses, and repentance. I'm going to leave these up here till Wednesday night, so don't anybody erase these. All right. Judgment's what we're going to be talking about today. First half of Joel gets pretty heavy into judgment. Later in chapter 2 gets into promise. The whole theme tied into repentance, right? So if you remember those 3 words at the end of this class, great. You probably now know more about Joel than most people do, okay? So we're past 101, now we're into the 201 second year class for Joel. All right, chapter 1. For someone who read it, what's happening? What's happening in Judah to prompt Joel's appearance?
Pest control problem.
Pest control problem, yeah. Specifically, what kind of pest? Locusts, right? This is not a couple of bugs showed up, ate some corn stalks, and left, right? Right at the beginning, Joel says it's unprecedented, right? Verse 2, unprecedented. Unforgettable, right? It specifically says in verse 3, you'll talk about this for a long time. This is waves of locusts, right? Why does that matter? Sorry, that's a non-specific question. Let me ask it a different way. Why is it important that Joel emphasize the severity of what's happening? Take a stab. You won't be wrong, I promise.
Well, if it was a mild event, then they could attribute it to chance. But the severity kind of makes you think there must be something more going on.
I think that's absolutely right? This is not Joel popping in after some minor fracas, right? In verse 4, just to underline how bad this is, right? He speaks about gnawing locusts, swarming locusts, creeping locusts, stripping locusts, right? This is wave upon wave upon wave until nothing is left. There's some interesting stuff, and I don't want to get too much into locusts because it's 9:30 in the morning, and I don't want to start your day off too creepy. But it's really interesting to look at, and locusts are something most of us have no firsthand experience with, right? The life cycle of a locust that comes back again and again and again, whether the big grasshopper or the larva or whatever, kind of lines up with what he's talking about here. Ben shared an interesting thing with me. I don't frequently read 109-year-old articles from National Geographic, but I mean, just light reading. It was actually kind of fun because it is interesting to go back and remember how people wrote 100 years ago. It's very surprisingly informal. But there was a photographer who did some writing, who's actually born in Jerusalem, but he's of American descent. A guy named John David Whiting, who wrote an article in National Geographic more than a century ago, actually looking at what happened when a plague of locusts came to Jerusalem. And the way it lines up with this gnawing and stripping and swarming thing is so interesting, because it's like this swarm descends, blocks out the sun, lays eggs, later the larva comes out. Again, I won't belabor the point, but it lines up really well with what Joel's describing here. Now, you will read some folks who say the locusts in Joel are literal enemies or armies. I think we just take Joel at face value here. I can't tell you for sure these weren't locusts, but it lines up with the way a locust invasion would occur. So we're just going to say these are definitely locusts. All right, so the locusts descend, they strip the crops, everything's gone. What happens after that? You don't even have to have read the book to know this part. What happens when all the vegetation gets eaten and the sun beats down? It ruins everything, right? So they've got drought, they've got famine, they've got despair, right? There's nothing left. And that's all in, verses 7, 10, 11, 8, 7 through 12 for the most part. Now, Joel is describing to them something that has presumably just happened or is still occurring. Why would Joel do that? Why take some time to recap? Why take some time to tell people the situation that they can see with their own eyes? This answer's not in Joel. You gotta use your brains for this one.
Sometimes the most effective preaching that we can do comes on the heels of something that's just happened, a major event that's just taken place.
Absolutely. That's for sure one of the reasons, right? You're setting the stage, right? You're giving people context. Joel has a message to deliver here, right? It's like a lawyer making a case, right? Think about they get in the courtroom, they just cut right to the end and go, he's guilty, Your Honor. You don't need to hear from me. It happens. No, they lay out the case, right? Joel has a message to deliver here. He's got to lay out the evidence, right? Here's what's happening. Two other reasons why he might do that. One, it's just a really effective way to structure anything. Think about the Gettysburg Address. 7 years ago, our 4/3. Nobody in that audience was unfamiliar with the history of the United States at that point. But you're making a case. You're making an oratory or written case. The other thing is, this is for us as well, right? This is prophecy. This is for people, not us necessarily specifically, but anyone reading this afterward might not be familiar with what was happening in Judah at that point, right? So it's background, it's context. All right, so going on to chapter 1, verse 13 and 14, what does Joel recommend? Anybody who did the reading there, this is the first time Joel kind of weighs in and says, here's some things you might consider doing. Say it again? Yeah. What else?
Fast.
Right? Fast, mourn, call everybody together. Verse 14, cry out to the Lord. All right, this is probably a good time to bring this up. What had the people of Judah done to warrant this invasion of locusts and this visit from Joel? Do we know? Turned away from God. Do we know anything more specific than that? No, not really. And we kind of have to infer that. I mean, obviously it's common sense. Yes, sir?
It's kind of inferred that, talking about drunkards, and they were taking everything for granted, that they're going to get harvest.
Absolutely. There are several things sort of inferred. Do we know specifically what they did? Not really. But yeah, you're right. We get some drunkards mentioned. Later in the book, and we'll get to this in chapter 2, there's a call to turn back to the Lord. So what can we infer from that? They have turned from the Lord. Joel is an interesting study in specific vagary. There's a lot of stuff in here that could apply to a lot of different things. We don't have a lot of real tight specifics on what Judah had done or what had warranted this. But ultimately they'd turned from the Lord, and it's bad enough that they are now facing swarms of locusts, devastation, drought, famine, fire, etc. Chapter 1, verse 15. I'm actually, if you're not already turned to Joel, turn to it now. Chapter 1, verse 15. I do want to read that one. Joel has just described what everybody's going through, recommends that they call the people together, and then he says, alas for the day of the Lord is near, and it will come as destruction from the Almighty. the day of the Lord. Commit that to memory. You are going to hear it from some of my colleagues that are going to deliver some of these other books. The day of the Lord comes up a lot in prophecy. It comes up 5 times in Joel alone, this exact phrase, and lots of other places. 2 Peter, 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians, 1 Corinthians, Philippians. There's lots and lots of places. Hit a Google search of the day of the Lord. You're gonna find plenty of verses. What is, anybody want to take a stab? What is the day of the Lord? Judgment. Yeah, it's not any more complicated than that. Judgment. Judgment now or the final judgment?
Could be either.
That's absolutely right. Could be either. There are plenty of verses in the Bible where the day of the Lord, the final judgment, is mentioned. There are also quite a few places, and we're going to again hit them in this class, where the day of the Lord is, for lack of a better term, a specific judgment, a judgment based on something that is happening at the moment. Whether the specific judgment or the final judgment, it is a judgment from the Lord. Actually shortcutted myself here. Ben mentioned, I can't remember if it was Sunday or Wednesday, he brought up a verse in Deuteronomy, and if you'll turn there, Deuteronomy chapter 28, and verse 58 and 59. Chapter 28, verse 58 and 59 is what I'm going to read. If you are not careful to observe all the words of this law, and the law to the people of Israel, which are written in this book, to fear this honored and awesome name, the Lord your God, then the Lord will bring extraordinary plagues on you and your descendants, even severe and lasting plagues, and miserable and chronic sickness. Does what's happening in Joel line up with that? Boy, it sure seems like it, right? It's, miserable and lasting, right? That's a lot of what we're reading here in Joel, right? Remember that. Gnawing, swarming, stripping, crawling locusts, right? Strip the fields bare to bare ground. Joel actually goes on after this. He mentions the day of the Lord in verse 15. And then he spends 5 more verses explaining just how bad it is. So starting in verse 16, there's a whole list of things that have been, I guess, there's probably no better word for it, that have been stripped away from the people of Judah as a result of this plague. Verses 16 through 20 is where I am. Anybody want to list off something that's been taken away? I'll give you a second, just in case you haven't looked at it. Food, right? Food is one. No food. I mean, that obviously comes along sensibly from the crops being destroyed. No food. What else has been taken away?
Joy and gladness.
Joy, right? Boy, how bad's it got to be that there's no joy or gladness to be found? What else? Water. It's down in verse 20, no water. What else?
The implication is their animals, their cattle are wasting away because of lack of food.
Right? Their livestock is starving. Right? They're not only losing their agricultural products and their water, now they're losing their protein sources as well.
That would also have a monetary effect on them.
Yeah, absolutely. 100% the implication here is they got nothing left.
And all this bad stuff is happening and they're called the fast. I just find that.
Yeah, kind of. They may not have a huge choice about the fasting part. That's an interesting point. What else? What else are they dealing with? Maybe not taken away from them, but that they're facing at this point. Again, in verses 16 through 20.
What about fire?
Fire, right? Why are they facing fires? The crops are all chewed up, the leaves are all gone, the water's gone, and they're in a semi-arid desert.
The seeds shriveled. Even the seeds are shriveled.
Right. No planting. You can plant new things, but they're not going to grow. I got one more. It's in verse 17.
There's storage.
Storage.
Thing is-
They aren't even just out of food and out of water and losing their livestock. Their stores are gone, right? There's no grain in the grain towers. There's nothing left in the barn. What are you thinking? Put yourself in Judah at this moment with everything gone. What's your mindset? It feels like death, right? And death certainly must have come to some. We don't have the details of that. What else?
I think we take for granted too that, we have trucks that'll just bring in food, and I think
Right.
back then everything was so localized, it's not that simple for them, if all the food is gone there, it's not like they can snap their fingers and bring it from somewhere else.
That's right. There's not a C-130 dropping cargo supplies, from the air from some aid program, right? They're on their own.
They would also be vulnerable to another nation coming and attacking them.
Absolutely, right? That's a real fear back in this time.
I feel like all their necessities are being taken away from it. It's like desperation.
Despair, absolutely.
There's nothing. There's nowhere to turn. There's nothing to have. So
That's absolutely right.
what do you do?
What do you do? That's a great question.
It brings on hopelessness in realizing that there is no way that they can be dependent on themselves.
That's right.
Locusts start looking real good.
Now, I said I was going to spare you some of this because it's 9:30 in the morning, but certainly, and by the way, if you go back into the law, they are allowed to eat locusts. It's in there. There's some locust and honey references and some other things. There's some pretty good recipes you can find online if you ever come across a big pile of locusts. But yeah, I would assume. I mean, we don't have this detail in here, but
Locust soup.
you eat what's available to you. I would guess. I would guess that's the case.
It struck me last night, I was reading from the Christian Standard Version last night, and in verse 12, the way they put it at the end of that verse is, indeed, human joy has dried up. And I was like, man, that is,
Yeah, she's talking about chapter 1, verse 12, the very end there. I'm working out of the New American Standard. Indeed, rejoicing dries up from the sons of men. All right, now that's rough. I mean, you think about the worst times, people still find reasons to laugh, rejoice, etc., right? Even at times, in the Depression, people still got married, right? It's that kind of thing. How bad does it have to be that the crops are gone, the water's gone, your fields are burning? I didn't throw this in earlier, but there were in that 1915 National Geographic article, it talks about one of the later waves of plagues after all the easy things have been stripped, literally eating the bark off of trees, right? Stripping the bark from trees. You don't even have trees with bark remaining. It's so bad that rejoicing dries up from the sons of men. Now, all of this is leading to Joel saying, and this is me paraphrasing, but this expression came to my mind so many times reading this. If you think that's bad, we're going to get into chapter 2, verse 1 through 11. Here's how bad it can be. All right, so Joel's gone pretty dark with chapter 11, right? This is not a happy, feel-good story at all. He's going to put the cherry on this particular Sunday in the beginning of chapter 2. Now, there are a couple things about this section here. Chapter 2, verses 1 through 11, that I kind of want to address at the beginning. There's a description here, and it starts right off in verse 1 saying, "For the day of the Lord is coming, surely it is near." So the next 10 verses after that are Joel's description of the day of the Lord. In reading about everything, I mentioned earlier that there's some who think the locusts at the beginning of the book are actual literal armies. Well, there's an inverse to that too. There are some folks who think what's described in verses 2 through 11 is either a literal or, maybe not literal, but the army of the Lord. Some say, well, it's just describing the locusts that he's already dealt with. What I would say is this. It doesn't really matter which one you think it is. It's a description of the judgment of the Lord. And he clearly, and again, kind of what I said before about effective communication, he's drawing parallels to what's happening now, right? All right, right now you're dealing with waves and waves of locusts. The day of the Lord is going to be similar to that in a lot of ways, except way, way worse, right? So he says, surely it is near. All right. If you're a bunch of people who are starving, joyless, desperate, and the message from Joel says, surely it is near, Joel has your attention at this point, right? It's a pretty effective way to get people to listen to the actual message Joel is coming to say. What we get in verses 2 through 11 is a picture of utter and unavoidable devastation, right? Verse 3, a fire consumes before them, and behind them a flame burns. The land is like the Garden of Eden before them, but a desolate wilderness behind them, and nothing at all escapes them. It's describing the army of the Lord. There are some very clear things here, though, that are going to make the people who are receiving this message think very much about these swarms of locusts that have been pouring in. Down in verse 10, before them the earth quakes, the heavens tremble, the sun and the moon grow dark, and the stars lose their brightness. What is Joel describing here besides judgment? How complete is the devastation Joel is describing here? Fully, right? Hey, Judah, if you think the swarms of locusts have left you nothing, the day of the Lord will top that. There is no escaping. There is nothing left, right? Think about receiving this message, right? In that time, in that moment. I mean, you're starting to feel pretty worried, right? You're probably already pretty worried. Now you're feeling like there's no hope at all. Look at verse 11. The Lord utters his voice before his army. Surely his camp is very great. For the strong is he who carries out his word. The day of the Lord is indeed great and very awesome. And who can endure it? The easiest question I ask today, who can endure it? The day of the Lord? Nobody, right? It was interesting. I actually hadn't intended to talk about this National Geographic thing hardly at all. In fact, I have a note in here, Ben, that says Nat Geo from Ben, optional. But it keeps kind of flashing back in my mind. One of the things that the writer describes quite a bit while they're facing this plague of locusts in Jerusalem in the early 20th century is these attempts to withstand these plagues, right? So first they come swarming in, giant clouds of flying grasshoppers, for lack of a better description, about 2.5 inches long, millions and millions and millions of them. And what's your reaction, right? I mean, think about like you're in your house, you look down at the floor, and there's a trail of ants coming in. They've found some tiny, minuscule piece of food that your pets and or children have left in a place that you didn't see, and the ants have found it, right? What do? Just let them.
Ants raid and you start spraying everywhere.
That's right. That's right.
Traps.
That's right. At no point do you go, well, that's all right. No, you immediately you look for what they're finding, and then you look for the source, and then you probably break out the bug spray and you say, everybody get out because I'm spraying poison, right? You attack them. All right, fine, you deal with that, and you wake up tomorrow and there's another line of ants. And this time you're like, no, that's fine, right? Oh, you get the raid again, right? And if it keeps happening, you call the pest company and you say, come out here and tent my house. I have a problem. You fight, right? So that was actually the first instinct of the writer of this article, who, again, was born in Jerusalem but lived in something called the American Colony. There was a group of Presbyterians that kind of set up sort of an American area. Their reaction to these was to fight. And in fact, the government put in some things that said, if you bring us so many, we'll pay you a certain amount of money, right? They're fighting. They're trying to kill these locusts, they're trying to capture them. There's all these interesting, inventive ways that they try. And it's so interesting because he recounts a conversation he had with one of the folks who was native to the area, whether it was Palestinian or some form of Arab in the area. And they actually had an expression for these invasions of locusts that translates to God's army. I can't remember exactly, but it was Allah in another word. Anyway, the point is, their approach was, they're going to eat everything, right? The writer of this keeps fighting and fighting and fighting. And when you get all the way to the end of the article, he actually comes all the way around to, we killed and killed and killed and captured and burned and did everything we could. And at the end of it, the bark was gone off the trees and the leaves were gone off the trees and the grass was gone off the ground. It's this realization that this plague, no matter how hard you fought it, could not be overcome. Now that's just an earthly invasion of a naturally occurring insect. What Joel's describing in chapter 2, 1 through 11, is levels and levels above that, right? It's unavoidable in every way. So Joel he's walked into a place that had a lot of darkness and no joy, and he's now thrown a really dark blanket over the top of them and turned off all the lights, right? This is bad. It can get worse. And at this moment, this is a really effectively written book. As somebody who writes and edits for a living, I have a real appreciation for things that are written this way. Because he comes in verse 12, and he flips the light switch on, right? Everybody is absolutely bummed out by everything he said so far. And he goes, and again, I'm reading from the New American Standard. This is my wording. Yet, even now, says the Lord. Lets him off the hook. Yet, even now, as bad as it is and as bad as it can be, yet even now declares the Lord, return to me with all your heart, and with fasting, weeping, and mourning. Rend your heart and not your garments. Now return to the Lord your God, for he is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in loving kindness, and relenting of evil. You can fix this, Judah, but the Lord calls you to turn back to him. Yet even now. Now we're going to get into, and I think Ben explained the structure of this class a bit. We're going to, for the first half, and it was weeks 1 through 7, not 1 through 8, Ben, but I decided not to correct you when you were talking. We're going to survey some of these minor prophets. And when we get to week 8 and through the end, we're going to come back. We're going to talk about some of the topical lessons we get from some of these. I'm going to spoil it for you. Week 8, we're going to be talking about those 2 verses. Yet even now, as bad as this is, as desperate as your situation is, the Lord in his loving kindness provides a way for the people of Judah. All right, what do they have to do, though, to get that, right? So Joel says you can escape may be the wrong word, you can avoid this specific judgment if you do what? Verses 15 through 17, he gives them some advice about what they can do. Starting in verse 15, look in there again like we did before. What things does Joel prescribe the people can do? Fast, sure. Like we mentioned before, that might be pretty easy. What else? Assemble. Not just assemble, but assemble who? Everybody. It's very specific about everybody. The infants, the bride from her bridal chamber, the sick, the elderly, the young, the old. Every single person of Judah is to be gathered, right? Gather everybody. The people, it says. What else? Say again? Weep, right? It says priests weep in the temple, right?
It shouldn't be hard though, because you're starving.
You would hope, although if you're also suffering from dehydration, maybe weeping would be tough. But certainly calls for the priests to weep. There's one other one in there. Sanctify. And then one more. Right at the beginning, in verse 15. Blow the trumpet, right? Proclaim an assembly. Not just kind of gather some folks.
Blow a trumpet in Zion is used twice.
Right.
Here. In verse 1, it's more sound the alarm.
Right.
The army is coming. Get prepared.
Right.
And then in verse 15, it's call to worship.
Right.
And call to assembly.
Right. So that bell we're about to get here in like 1 minute,
You did.
it's that. Everybody get together. We're going to, seek the Lord's mercy. In verse 17, it says, have the priests call out, spare your people, O Lord. Joel warns them here, don't you hold anything back. Right? This is so bad. You have to commit every person, every thought, every action to seeking forgiveness. We're going to go on from this and talk about the light and the promise Joel offers and
Hey,
Wednesday.
Real quick, if you want to read this Nat Geo article that he's referenced, it's from the January 1915 issue. It's free on Google Books. You can get a PDF of it. It's called Jerusalem's Locust Plague, January 1915, Nat Geo.
It's got pictures and everything. It's great. Read the back half of chapter 2 and chapter 3 for Wednesday and see you all then. Thanks, everybody.